Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Centre for Legal Innovation's Legalpreneurs Spotlight on video. Yay! Our wonderful guest today is Camilla Barsh Anderson, and we are going to chat with her a little bit more in just a second, but I'm kind of going to set the scene for this particular Spotlight series. We're launching this year, not just in video, but also with a focus called Future 50. And in Future 50, we're going to be bringing to you 50 individuals who are really creative thinkers and doers in the legal innovation space. And Camilla very kindly agreed to launch this amazing series for us. And so we're super excited on so many different levels. It's hard to contain it all at the moment.
Well, thank you for having me, Terry.
Of course, it's just wonderful to have you. Camilla is a professor at the University of Western Australia Law School. She does a million different things. She's a trade law expert and a whole bunch of other things. It was amazing reading your bio, Camilla. It was absolutely fantastic. But today we're getting her to focus on something that's just kind of amazingly exploded, which is this whole area of comic book contracting. And Camilla actually is the senior project leader at UWA for the comic book contracting project. So Camilla, hello again.
Hi, Terry. Good morning from Western Australia.
From sunny Western Australia and sunny Brisbane by the looks of it, right?
Very sunny. I think we're always competing about who has the most sunlight.
Well, look, I wanted to kick off by asking a pretty obvious first question, but also helping us to set the scene. And that is, what is comic book contracting or a comic book contract? And I guess, where did it start? How does that fit into the visual contracting and relational contracting scene? So plant the seeds for us and get us kicked off on this.
All right, Terry, that's a huge question. And thank you. That gives me a lot to talk about. So, I mean, comic book contracting is just a word, but it's a word that we specifically chose as sort of serious law academics because we wanted to provoke. The idea is that you create a contract with visuals. And we can stack in as many comics and drawings as we like. We can turn it into a comic strip contract, or you can just have a couple of visuals with some drawn images. I would classify all of that as a comic book contract. The word comic contracting itself is actually trademarked by Robert DeRoy and his creative contracting people. But I don't really care what we call it. I put this label very broadly on visual contracts that have images, plain language, and that try very hard to be transparent and clear and focus on the relationship of a given contractual partnership, and simply try to do things in a different way by rethinking the contract and putting the relationship first, and those really weird and relatively, let's be honest, lawyers, unnecessary clauses that cater to the 0.001% of difficult complexities, just get rid of them and focus on the mainstream of what's significant for that contractual relationship that you're currently having to advise in. So that's what I would deem comic book contracting. The nicer word is sort of visual contracts. So if we have to be writing articles in journals that don't like the idea of comic books, oh God, that can't possibly be serious, then we call it visual contracts or contracts with images. I think there's a lot of sort of prejudice against the notion of the word comic in that context. But like I said, we're using it deliberately to try and provoke. As an academic in this white ivory tower, I see myself as charged with the obligation to hammer down some conventions and lead the charge on change. I think that's what all academics in all disciplines are charged to do. And so I think it falls on us to try and be the Trojan horses on these comic book contracts. And over the past 5-6 years, when we've been churning them out, it's actually gained massive momentum. And I think people are beginning to sit more comfortably with the idea. But you will notice that some of the contracts I show you are sort of advertised as visual contracts, not comic book contracts. To me, that's just a word.
So let's have a look at some of them. Bring them up because
I'd be really happy to. What I'm sharing with you now is the very first comic book contract that we developed in 2015. And this is a non-disclosure agreement for the UWA Makers Challenger project. So that was an academic unit that is still run here at UWA and is now in its, I think, its 7th year of massive success, and has grown exponentially.
These are engineering students, right?
Yeah,
these
so
were
this
not
is
lawyers.
Actually a unit for engineering students, where engineering students are asked to consult with industry for academic credit. And as you can probably imagine, when students are being asked to consult on the newest and coolest ideas, there's a lot of non-disclosure agreements coming that way because industry doesn't want students to talk about it. But before they understood what a non-disclosure agreement really meant, they would just sign these and then get really excited about what they were talking about. And it was a real liability for the university. So my colleague and friend, Adrian Keating, who helped kickstart this project, beautiful guy, was so frustrated with lawyers because they were churning out these non-disclosure agreements that nobody understood, nobody read, they just signed them. But it didn't do anything. It didn't actually change the behavior of his students. So late one night in Brisbane, as it would happen, at a conference on something completely unrelated, we had a couple of drinks and he spewed some venomous words about how awful lawyers were. And my response was, well, what the heck do you want, Adrian? A comic book? And he just went quiet for a minute. He said, yeah, that'd be great, actually.
Wow.
And it probably bears mentioning that at the time I was heavily involved in learning how to make social stories for our autistic son. So I was used to thinking about images as part of sort of very basic communication. And also for the last 5 years, I had been part of the think tank at the Proactive Law Group in Scandinavia, which is all about rethinking the role of communication, plain language, and easier contracting methodologies. So I think the leap wasn't that big, actually. We had a lot of illustrations about contracts and illustrations sort of introducing and explaining contracts, but none actually that were contracts. And so it was sort of the next natural step.
And these, as I'm looking at this now, Camilla, it looks like the people that are represented would be the parties to the agreement, and then the terms are kind of represented within the images, but also supported by other text. Yes. Is that right? Yeah.
So, I mean, we try to keep the terms really, really simple, except where we can't, because lawyers are insisting that we use specific legal terms for good reasons. And then we always try to explain what they mean. But these people here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I mean, these are what we call the avatars. And there are lots of problems involved with developing avatars. That's something we've found now. We now have different graphic artists and a whole think tank for comic contracting that we work with. So we have access to a lot of different talents to find different styles, different brandings, but also different representations. Now, there are some obvious problems with the very first contract we created here. The ages, the genders, the skin colors, the body types. We haven't really catered very well to the nuances that should have been acknowledged there in our first contract, but we got better as we moved along.
And it's worth mentioning that you've put a lot of research behind this. I mean, I don't want folks to think that you've just kind of pulled things out of the air. You started to mention some of it, but I was just really
this one
impressed.
We did pull out of the air, which is why it comes all
the first one. It was the first one. Yeah, it's the first one. But you've gone in, you've had focus groups and you've done research, and there's been research folks working on it, right?
Absolutely. So this was just meant as a favor for a friend. I never saw this as becoming a research project when it first occurred.
Yeah.
But what then happened was, through the Proactive think tank, I was connected with Robert DeRoy in South Africa, who on the other side of the planet, just as you think you're doing something really unique, was at the same time developing his first comic contract, as he trademarks them. And I'll show you that. This is the Clement Gold contract. It takes a little while to load because we're now going to a website in South Africa.
Yeah.
But his contract, as you'll see, looks very different again.
Yeah, okay.
Because his contracts are made for people who cannot read, not for engineering students who can't read legalese and don't want to read contracts, but for students, for people, for food workers who are literally illiterate and who therefore will not respond well to words So see that this contract has very, very few words in it, where ours tend to have little speech bubbles and dialogue that people are happy and capable to read. So it's very visually represented and very, very few words. And these contracts, along with some of our subsequent contracts that we've also done for the disability sector and for other support institutions, have been acknowledged as very significant in terms of access to justice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is something we didn't even think about at the time, to be honest. But can I just attach a couple of remarks to this, because this is one of my favorite images in all the comic contracts that we've worked on and that we've collaborated on.
Sure.
So this is actually an image which was introduced to the contract that wasn't in the underlying written contract very well. This is about when someone is sick or when you have to go to a funeral, it's okay to be, you see the little outline of the man there, he's absent from work. It's okay to be absent from work if you have to be somewhere else. Now, from a practical risk assessment perspective, this was one of the biggest problems that these fruit plantations had with their fruit pickers, that the fruit pickers didn't realize they had that right. And so if they had to prioritize a funeral or a sick child, they would think they were in breach of contract and they wouldn't come back to work.
Wow.
So this image has actually been hugely instrumental in changing what was a very unfortunate practice and a lack of understanding and communication. Also, all of this, because it's so obvious what's going on and what your rights are as a worker, the onboarding for this particular set of workers has, as I understand it, been reduced from 4 hours to 45 minutes. Again, a significant savings.
Let's get into some of those benefits. And I know that you've touched on a number of them, but I know you've also got some fab stats to kind of share on this as well. And we've picked up on things like plain English, we've picked up on things like increased access to justice, understanding, being able to understand your rights and obligations a lot better, no matter who you are, but also making sure that the images reflect the audience that is going to be using them. But I know that the benefits run deeper and broader even than that. So I'd love to just ask you a little more about that as well.
Yeah, so I think that's probably a really good idea. So I'll take you to the comic book contract website again.
Yep.
And this time I'll take you to the Oricon contract. Now, Oricon were our first big sponsor, and we remain incredibly grateful to them. They've done a lot of work, not just in promoting what it is that we do, but also in allowing us to experiment with their business. How cool are they? So what I'm going to show you now is an employment contract. I'm just going to full screen that. Now, for the Oricon contract, our first contract, we were asked to do something which was a little bit unusual, well, at least for us. So for this contract, we've got an embedded hello from the Phil Cox, who at the time was the general manager. But here we go with the principles. So this was our main benefit in this employment contract, was not just comprehension, which has tested off the charts over the last 6 years as we have psychometrically tested this. People who are listening, it's probably good to remember that because I work in a university with a lot of different schools and disciplines, I have the benefit of being able to pick teams that are not just in law. Now, obviously, I have graphic illustrators, but I've got more than that. I've got psychologists. I've got a whole handful of psychologists on different projects, whether it's a financial literacy expert or whether it's people who are experts in behavioral drivers. I've got experts that I can consult with. I've got people who work in the business school, people who work in engineering, people who work in media and communications, people who are experts in science communication, which is part of trying to simplify communication for all the other disciplines that for decades have had to simplify their communication with their clients, which is what law is only now learning how to do. So I'm very, very privileged as a researcher to have all these amazing people to work with, and they help me do this. So these are actually the values of Oricon. What they wanted was an employment contract that explains to the employee that this is a different kind of organization, and we put the values up front. And you can probably guess that my key performance indicator was to be playful with serious intent and make the complex simple. Very much what this contract was all about. But then the employee had to take an interactive test themselves to find out what kind of worker they are. This is actually quite important because it tells Oricon how to put together their teams when they send teams out on sites. Then they talk about training and you can see all the words on this. This is not made for illiterate people. This is made for people who can read, but would rather read a nice, engaging comic and focus on the relationship. It talks about values and incentives. This is one of my favorites. It's the only drawing I've actually drawn in any of the projects. Favorite in your authority. I think outside the box. And these were drawn by the very talented Gemma Young, who was part of the Oricon marketing team. We included timesheets as something that was important to do. But all of this is about values, and developing that avatar was actually, this was not very challenging for this particular project because the light bulb is the employee and the Oricon logo and what's now known as Oricon Bobby. Strongly inspired by the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man from Ghostbusters. Sorry, Ryman, but and then we have all the links for the actual onboarding in the contract itself. So when you sign up to Oricon, whether you're going to be cleaning the bathrooms or whether you're going to be running the company, they just got a new CEO, you'll be presented with this contract. The CEO will have some additional contracts as well about expense accounts, but you'll have to do your onboarding as you sign up. So So it's all done in one.
Fantastic.
And then you'll see I'll hear some of my favorite drawings. So I realize I'm off on a tangent here, but I've got to talk a little bit about these drawings. Oricon has now rolled this contract out in 8 different countries. And every time we roll it out in a new country, we have to be quite sensitive to how we represent the different images, because we had some focus group testing in Africa come back and ask why the bird is abducting the baby. Which, okay, so the stork does not mean maternity in all jurisdictions. Duly noted. So as a comparative lawyer, because I also teach research and comparative methodology, it was quite shameful to suddenly realize, yeah, of course, not only do words mean different things in different jurisdictions, guess what? So do images.
Yeah, absolutely.
So cultural and regional sensitivity is very important. And then here we have another favorite image. But I wonder if I can put your political sensitivity to the test, Terry. Why do you think the penguin is perfect for representing parenthood?
I have no idea.
Because both the mummy and the daddy penguin look after the baby penguin.
Okay, all right. Yeah, very good. I love it.
So these images, we think a lot about them. But what I'm trying to show you here is that the benefit of this contract is communicating to the employee, boy, this organization is different. This is what your employment contract looks like. We're very transparent about all the values, and it means a lot to us. So you can probably imagine, and there have been a couple of cases where people say, I don't really like this contract. And then the output is, well, then you probably shouldn't work for us, because this is the kind of organization we are. So putting the spirit of that organization and the values and the relationship parameters up front, that was the key benefit here in identifying what kind of relationship you're starting. It clarifies and signposts it right up front, to the point where Oricon now depends on visuals for everything. One of my favorite stories is that they convened for the annual financial report globally, and all the managing directors were really not happy with the fact, and this is I think it's about 4 years ago now, that there were no visuals in the financial report. So they actually asked to have it redone because they needed visuals and visual charts to simplify and explain everything. Why on earth not? So it's completely changed the culture of the way that they do things, and it's really helped to simplify and humanize the way that they conduct their business. And I think it's wonderful. I still get emails and messages on LinkedIn from people who just signed up to Oricon going, you made this contract, it's so awesome, it just really helped me feel great about the organization I was joining, which is fantastic. And I've also had some emails saying, thank you for making this contract, made it clear that I didn't want to work for them.
Yeah.
Again, that's it's who you are, and it's what you want, and it's an important thing. So that particular benefit of the spirit and the relationship, I think that's one of my favorites. But
I love that multidisciplinary approach though as well, that yes, you've got the folks who are obviously the artists, you've got the lawyers working on that as well. Yep. But it's also kind of bringing in things like user experience and design thinking and all of those things that we talk a lot about, but we seldom see. I'm sure we will see more of them so beautifully kind of captured together in a product that has been so incredibly useful. I mean,
for me, the multidisciplinarity is actually key to a lot of innovation in law, not just this. We will never learn to get better if we don't acknowledge the value and the valid contributions of other disciplines.
Oh, so absolutely.
For me, that was really like a blinkers off moment. Can you stop thinking that way, please? It's not actually about law. It's about law needing to change, and there's so much we can learn from the other professions.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I wanted to, this has just been a fantastic exploration of this subject. And by the way, congratulations on this. It's just absolutely amazing.
Thank you. I've got so much else to show you.
But I wanted to ask you, how do you see this going, not just in 2022 and beyond? Are you seeing real, and I know you've spoken with this, but are you seeing sustained momentum behind this movement, I'm going to call it? And I know it's been broadly referred to as things like graphic justice, and maybe you'd like to speak to that a little bit as well. But are you seeing all of that? Are you seeing it kind of gaining momentum? Do you see it petering off? And I think I know the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway.
Look, but when we first started this, as I said, it wasn't a research project. It was just a favor for a friend. And as a diehard commercial lawyer, I couldn't see it going anywhere because I thought it was, esoteric and weird. Now I really don't, because what we've felt over the last 6 years has been a massive hunger. It started in industry, not in law. Yeah. But now law is hungry for it too, because I think a lot of legal professionals, especially those who were keen to innovate to begin with, because they sensed that there was something a little bit off with our profession in the contract law space, a lot of them are deeply satisfied with the idea of creating something that their clients can actually understand, and that they can relate to what their clients actually need, and present them with something that is a bit more helpful in breaking down the barriers of communication in contractual relationships. So I think it's really changed hugely in the legal profession over the last 5 years. And I think it has gained momentum there. But I also think that there's different directions that this has been taken. In the research space alone, we started working on a huge project with neurology and psychology on looking at how in traumatic situations, visual law can actually help to lessen the trauma, which is really interesting. And we're getting some very interesting statistics back on that. Another thing that we've looked at is, as I said, over the last 6 years, we've been measuring comprehension, engagement, and perception of how people understand, how people engage with these contracts. Guess what? They actually read them. Yeah, which is fantastic. There was a post going viral on LinkedIn with a young man who was posting a picture of his letter from Bank West with his comic book contract. And then he was saying, "First product schedule I've ever read. Well done, Bank West."
Well, I've got to ask you the legal question on that. Are they legally binding?
Oh God, Terry, how can you? No, look, obviously that's a great question, and we get it absolutely all the time. So to answer your question, here's something I prepared earlier. So in 2017, Robert French gave his closing address where he made the not surprising call that of course these contracts are binding because there's no form requirement on contracts. What he rightly pointed out was that the real so that's the article there that anyone can reach from the UWA Law Review website. But anyone can make a contract in any form that they like. But the real challenge is, of course, is interpretation, getting the images right and making sure that a poor judge, if he does have a dispute come before him, which, by the way, I'll just mention again, there have been no disputes under any of these contracts at all. Incredible. We have 200,000 banking schedules in visual format there now, plus still no disputes. I honestly thought that once we hit the banking world, our beautiful clean stats would go away. No, not even in banking are there any disputes, which is breathtaking. So what I'll just do is I'll present to you and our audience with what I think is the world's only law review article in comic book form by Stuart Medley and Bruce Muttard, who were there at the 2017 conference. This is a lovely introduction to what comic book contracts are about. And it even has a little meta thing about how we can use images to convey feelings better. And here is that lovely image. At the comic book contract, Robert French said, as long as the pictures, can be interpreted, given meaning, the court should be able to deal with comic book contracts.
Absolutely. And I should also mention that folks do actually sign these as well, right?
Of course they do.
Yeah.
So you have to say your intent and you sign up to them either electronically if it's a digital comic book contract, or if it's a paper-based one printed out, then there is always a space for signing it. We're currently working with a lot of consent forms, and we've developed a way for children to indicate their assent, not to the contract itself, because they can't do that if they're under 18, but children, their consent that their parent or carer has done their best to explain to the child what's going on and what it is that's happening to them. So it's not even just about the law. It's about that relationship. So ensuring in consent forms that affect children, that the children are piping in and saying, yeah, I've read this, and my parent and guardian has done their best to explain to me what it is that they're saying yes to on my behalf. Consent is a huge and incredibly important part of that relationship that we're trying to improve with these contracts. And so we're never, ever going to change that.
No, I think, and with contracting being at the heart of so much of what we do as lawyers, and so much of what people interact with, or their experience of lawyers, really something like this that can promote a genuine understanding of obligations and responsibilities. And I can see how this must lead to better communication and, as you were saying earlier, less likelihood of disputes if everyone knows what's going on going in.
Yeah, and we often insert things in the visual contract that wasn't there before, because when we do the initial risk assessment of where the real pain points actually are, we often find things that wouldn't necessarily be identified by the lawyers, like the annoying thing that new recruits in engineering don't understand the value of timesheets and the importance of keeping them, because the company can't bill the client until they've got the timesheets. Something which I think lawyers might nod a little bit to.
Yeah, absolutely.
By putting a visual panel in the employment contract about the significance of that, and why that's important and how that needs to be done, that's an introduction rather than an editing floor casualty, as some lawyers call our editing of these contracts. And it's eliminated a huge problems for human resources. So that's one example of things that we actually put in, because it's a real world issue that needs to be looked at, not necessarily from a legal perspective, but from a behavioral driver perspective, that those are behaviors that we want to change.
And thinking about this and pushing us to think about things outside the box in a way, it's also addressing things that we may or may not have even touched on, as you were saying.
Yeah, and one of the things that Robert and DeRoy and I often talk about is this interesting thing. So most of his clients are actual commercial clients, and most of mine are sponsors. But they have one thing in common, and that is when we start to visualize some of their sort of nastier terms, and they become crystal clear, like the anti-competition clause in an employment contract is a classic. Once they realize what it really is, they're getting their employees to sign, and then you ask them the question, would you ever actually uphold this? And they're like, no, we've had some instances where this has happened, but we've decided not to sue. And then you ask them the obvious question, well, can I please take it out then?
Yeah.
Because it's not a very good relationship driver.
Yeah.
It's kind of nasty and possessive. You have a right to do it, but do you really want to?
Yeah.
And then they just think about it in a completely different way. And a lot of these have ended up on the cutting room floor, often to the lawyer's despair. But at the end of the day, since they're not being pursued anyway, what's the point?
But that's also kind of thinking about risk and liability in a different way as well. I mean, it's promoting, that thought process as well from, in that case, an employer and employee point of view.
Yes,
right?
And it is a completely different way of thinking. I've had a number of potential sponsors come to me where one part of a large organization wants visual contracts, but they're, after a couple of conversations with, especially usually the legal department, it's obvious that they're not ready for that change. We're not going to do a half-assed contract where things are visual, but they're still not relational. I have the luxury as a researcher of being able to say no thank you to sponsors who are not ready for that change.
Yeah.
And look, they might never be, and maybe their industry doesn't suit itself well to that. But for me, this is about focusing on the relationship and the simplified aspects of the behavioral drivers that need to change to make those relationships better. And it has been hugely successful.
Yeah.
Actually, there's something that I wanted to show you.
Sure.
This is a contract that I drew up with in collaboration with my husband's company, Alternative Contracting.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of my favorite contracts that we've worked on because there was no underlying contract. And for me, this is what I hope the future holds, that we come into a project with no script from a pre-existing legal contract, only with the pure wants and needs of a startup. So this is a very small contract. It's literally only one page.
Yep.
You'll see there's Dave, and there are Dave's values and how he prides himself as a handyman. There are his expectations. Tell me about the job, make sure it's safe, and pay me within 7 days. There's his warranty. If you're not happy, I'll come back within reason. And there's his sort of reservations that, if something unexpected happens, a dinosaur skull in your backyard, hey, things are going to get delayed and there could be extra costs. And that's it. Those are the only things that matter to Dave in his contracting for his clients. There's all the necessary details. This is how simple a contract can be.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, I'm not saying that contracts need to be that simple for everything, but it took less than a week and it costs less than $2,000 with images to develop a contract this simple, where there's such transparent and obvious interest in the behavioral drivers that are easily identified.
Yeah,
that's how simple it can be. And it just blows my mind when you think about how simple other contracts could be if we stopped as lawyers being so risk averse that we're trying to anticipate everything. Look, we can't anticipate everything, but what we can do is create a really healthy, clear boundary within which people may actually read the basic, most important behavioral drivers that's expected of them within the confines of their contracts. So yeah, so this is currently our flagship. We're working with sponsors that are potentially even bigger than Bankwest, but this is everywhere in West Australia, on the radio, on the television, backs of buses and in malls. And this is, of course, Bankwest's product schedules that are completely in comic book form. These have been eye-opening, and they've started a whole new movement within the project itself, because you talk about the future.
Yep.
The future is also marketing. So I've brought in a whole team from the business school now to start up a new branch of this project, and that is looking at the efficacy of transparent law as a marketing tool. Because what we've seen is Bankwest have very effectively promoted this as part of their Less BS campaign.
Yep.
Less bank stuff, they're calling it, but we all know what it really means. And it's been one of their most successful campaigns in decades. People are loving the idea of transparent law, and we're just getting a lot of really good publicity on it. So I'm working with the head of the marketing department at business school here at UWA, and a handful of RAs to try and put together models for measuring the impact of transparent law as a marketing tool. So I talk about a really interesting future development between that and the graphic justice and access to justice angle, which is attracting a lot of sponsorship. Robert DeRoy has just gotten a huge grant from the Hague Institute of Innovative Law, and we're being exhibited at the Supreme Court in Queensland.
It's fantastic, and I love that it's not just bringing, if you like, other disciplines to the law, but through this taking the law to other disciplines as well. I mean, it's just it's really just an amazing collaborative exercise and environment, I imagine. But look, congrats again on this. It's an absolutely amazing project.
Thank you. It's so much fun. It's been the best project. I mean, after 30 years in academia, where you get the feeling that nobody ever reads what you write and you don't really make a difference, this is so gratifying. We get our own hecklers now and then, and I still get people who stand up at conferences and yell that I'm dubbing down the law. But as my beautiful husband so eloquently puts it, how can it be dumber than not reading it or understanding it?
Yeah, absolutely. If our mission and objective as lawyers is to make sure that our clients understand their rights and obligations, it seems to me that this is right at the core of doing exactly that.
Certainly one way of ensuring it. And visuals have such proven track record in ensuring better retainability of information in the human mind. It seems silly not to use that tool when we're communicating often very complex expected behaviors. Why not include that very important mnemonic tool for memory?
And I think if we think about all of the people that have imparted or transferred knowledge the best way to us, it's for me, it's always been by presenting something in a diagrammatic form where you can follow it and you can understand it. And to me, this is just, you know, really putting this on steroids in a way, and in a much larger audience, but with the core philosophy, I guess, being quite similar. So yeah, again, absolutely fantastic. Can't wait to see just how much this is going to develop, not just this year.
I can't wait to share more when it comes out. I mean, we're working on business to business contracts as well. It's been more difficult to convince sponsors to let us play with their main core business, but we've managed on a couple of occasions, so it's happening.
Fantastic. And thank you very, very much again for kicking off our Future 50 series. I know that folks can contact you. They'll find you on LinkedIn as well as obviously the UWA Law School website. So the comic book
contract website has my details, and you can always find me through UWA as well. I'm not going anywhere. I love living in Perth.
So do reach out to Camilla, because I know she's there. Thanks again, Camilla. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Terry. It's an honor to kick off this series as an innovator, and I wear that badge proudly. Thank you.
Thanks again. Bye.